Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Thank you for being here. I told Chris earlier, bless all your hearts for being here to support an amateur on Super Bowl Sunday. Hopefully it's not going to be that bad. I'm going to refrain from telling you the title of my lesson for the time being, and I'll get to that in a second. I am going to go into a description of David, King David, with some tidbits and some facts and some accolades in regards to him before I get to the title of the lesson. Youngest of 8 brothers, son of Jesse, the shepherd boy or man. And that's as Chris and I discussed, he may have been older than maybe we think. Killed a bear and a lion on 2 separate occasions protecting the flock. Player of the harp and other instruments. Player of the harp for King Saul, when Saul was struggling with the evil spirits in his head and so forth. Shortly after, around that time, was put in position of Saul's armor bearer. Soon came on the scene with great might and killed the giant Goliath with a stone from a slingshot. At that point, Saul set him over the men of war. Was sung about in the streets by women that he killed his tens of thousands versus only thousands of Saul, which was the turning point there for David, in which Saul then was jealous and envious and didn't trust David anymore in regards to his growing popularity. Eventually anointed king of the tribe of Judah after Saul and Jonathan were killed. Again conquered and killed thousands of adversaries, mostly the Philistines. Ruled from 1090 to 970 BC, and everything he seemed to touch turned to gold, so to speak. Everything he did was successful, obviously with the help of God. But what's missing from this list of facts and accolades? You don't have to answer. I'll answer for you. He was given the title of a man after God's own heart. Can you imagine being told from God, the Creator, and described as the one after his own heart? You can't get a greater compliment than that. But why David? Why was David described this way? What was it that made David different than anybody else? Where did this first come from? We first read about this description of David in 1 Samuel 13:14. It reads, "But now your kingdom shall not endure. The Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has anointed him ruler over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." This verse is Samuel speaking to Saul in regards to what Saul had done wrong. And what Saul did was he took matters into his own hand. He got ahead of himself. He got anxious and afraid and impatient and did not wait for the command, which was to wait for Samuel to arrive prior to offering up burnt offerings and peace offerings before going to war with the Philistines. He got anxious because the Philistines were mounting in his position that he was in, and he again offered up the burnt offerings prior to waiting for Samuel. This was the first of his issues, the first of his problems, which started his demise. Did not trust as he should have. And that was Samuel telling him, your kingdom now will not endure. You messed it up. But a chapter or two later, we see another example of his demise. On a second occurrence in the 15th chapter of 1 Samuel, Saul was again disobedient to God's command, in which he took King Agag captive, as well as took some of the choicest spoils of the animals with them, as opposed to what he was told to do, which was to annihilate all of, I forgot the peoples. The Amalekites. Help me say it.
Amalekites.
Yes. He was to annihilate all of them, leave nobody behind, not any animal or anyone, but he ended up taking the king as well as the choicest of the spoils. Again, when Samuel got to him, he is like, "What have you done?" And there was a conversation prior to this next verse that I'll read. There was a conversation between the two in which Saul was saying, "I did what I was supposed to. I conquered. I killed. We only took a few. They're going to be offered up as sacrifices for the Lord," which was not what he was supposed to do. And now listen to what Samuel now tells Saul. Coming from Samuel 15, verses 22 and 23. After that short conversation between the two, here's Samuel telling Saul. And Samuel said, Has the Lord as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed then the fat of rams. For rebellion is the sin of divination, and insubordination is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. So essentially at this point, Saul's rejected by God. Now he goes on to be king for many, 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 many more years. But at this point, God has already chosen, as we saw earlier in a chapter prior to that, or 2 chapters prior to that, that he has already sought after David. David's coming on board here in the next chapter onto the scene, where Samuel will now go and seek him from Jesse. The question is, what then makes David different than Saul? And what is it about David's character that gives him the title of a man after God's own heart? And that's the gist of the devotional, is that we're going to touch on some characteristics of David that makes him fall under this great compliment from God. Well, let's start with his faith. First was his faith, David's faith. We know it had to be tremendous. He had utter faith that God would watch over him. In regards to what we know as David as his first big accomplishment, the fun story and the exciting story of when he fights Goliath and wins. That's what we tend to remember about David first and foremost, and what it was his faith in that God would help him prevail. He wasn't afraid to go to the front lines. He wasn't afraid of the statements he was making. He wasn't afraid to tell Saul, "I'll go out and do it," or his brothers. And we see that. It took courage. But right prior to Goliath and David literally starting to go towards one another, David is talking to Goliath, and he says quite a few things that I'll avoid reading here, but at the very end of what David says to Goliath is this: that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. 1 Samuel 17:47. David gave God all the credit, and it was through his faith that God empowered him to be successful against Goliath. It's only one example. We probably could go into many, many more examples of all these characteristics. I'm only going to use one example of each for time's sake. But faith was the first of many. Secondly, David's trust was huge in regards to trusting in the Lord. We see here later on, as David's popularity grew, Saul's distrust towards David grew. And it was at one point that Saul wanted to kill David. And David had to eventually literally escape his presence. He literally left the home, so to speak, and was off in hiding. However, David respected Saul, respected the office of the king, that the anointed one from God. And David did have opportunity to take Saul out. He could have sped this process along, but he did not. One of those opportunities, if you recall, is where David was hiding out in a cave, and Saul happened to enter that cave. Scripture says to relieve himself, and David had an opportunity to sneak up on him and kill him. David snuck up on him just enough to cut a fringe of his robe off, somehow not being heard or seen or felt. As Saul left the cave, and as David tells his men and convinces his men that I am not going to lay hands on the Lord's anointed, I am not going to harm him, he actually begins to feel bad that he cut the fringe off of his robe, and actually leaves the cave, calls out to Saul as he's leaving, gets his attention, and has a conversation with Saul. And essentially at the end of that conversation, from I guess afar, he says, "May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge me on you, but my hand shall not be against you. As the proverb of the ancient says, out of the wicked comes wickedness, but my hand shall not be against you." 1 Samuel 24, 12 and 13. David showed complete trust in God, that God would save him from Saul, and God would eventually install him as king when God is ready for David to be king. Thirdly, David's love. David exhibited a type of agape love back then, as we are to have today, putting the needs of one another before our own. David's agape example of love was that as he's trying to be killed by King Saul, he loves him enough not to. He prays for him. He avoids him. He had the opportunity to do something and didn't. He showed love towards Saul. It was interesting that David showed this type of love 1,000 years before Jesus teaches at the Sermon on the Mount that we are to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. He demonstrates this 1,000 years before Jesus teaches and commands this of us today. Fourthly, David's humility. He was a humble man. He, as you know, had remarkable success on the battlefield. Essentially, never lost. But he always stayed extremely humble. David was offered by Saul's second daughter, Michal. And here's what David says in regards to being offered Michal as his wife, to be his wife from his daughter. "Is it trivial in your sight to become the king's son-in-law, since I am a poor man and lightly esteemed?" Some versions may say, "because I'm a poor man and insignificant." 1 Samuel 18:23. Later in his kingship, after much more success, the prophet Nathan told David that the Lord was going to extend his family's dynasty forever. And here's what David said. David prayed, "Who am I, O Lord God? And what is my house, that thou hast brought me this far?" 2 Samuel 7:18. David had great success in all he did, but he never took credit for it. He always gave God the glory. David had integrity. David would own up to and would be responsible for when he would mess up. One example of this is when David had to lie to the priest in regards to asking for food and a weapon. Ahimelech was the name of the priest in the city of Nod, the town of Nod. As he was fleeing Saul, he comes across and asks for the food and a weapon. To speed the story along, Saul eventually finds out what took place. And because of that, as a result of that, Saul had all the priests killed, which was 85 of them, and everyone in the city of Nod put to death. One person escaped and found David. One of the priests, his name, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, is Abiathar. And when he came and told David what had taken place, David took responsibility for the lie that he did. And he took him in. He took this priest in to be with him going forward. He said, those who want to kill you want to kill me too. You will be safe with me. Stay with me. And he takes him in. So he took responsibility for what eventually took place, sadly. Another, I'm getting to the end, don't worry, but another one of the characteristics of David was that he would take responsibility, kind of like the integrity that he exhibited, but he would take responsibility when he sinned. And we all know of the big sin. We all know of the story of Bathsheba. And what it led to, and what it led to, and what it led to was one big, vicious lie and multiple sins. He convinced himself that he didn't do anything wrong. I don't know if he just had to try to fool himself into what he did and try to ignore it, but it was the prophet Nathan that had to make him realize through the story what it was that David had done. And after David realized that he was the one and that he was the sinner, he had said, I have sinned against the Lord. I lost my spot. Yes, he had said, I have sinned against the Lord, 2 Samuel 12:2. Because of this great sin, we know that David wrote the 51st Psalm, where he earnestly and brokenheartedly sought God's forgiveness, confessed the sin that he committed, the multiple sins, looked for God's forgiveness, and looked for God's restoration in it. So we know he took responsibility and he sought after forgiveness from his wrongs. Lastly, we also know that David was never shy of worship. He always worshiped God, no matter what the situation was. He worshiped God in his lowest points. He worshiped God in his highest points. We see the worshiping through his psalms and the prayers within them, always giving God glory, praise, reverence, and honor. Those were 7, if you were counting, 7 different characteristics of David, in which helps describe the title of a man after God's own heart. Did I ever get back to tell you that? In the very beginning, did I ever come back and tell you that? I was supposed to come back and tell you the title was A Man After God's Own Heart. If you hadn't already figured that out. And it was what it took to be considered that. Oh yeah, I totally forgot my introduction. I had thought about this topic after coming across something a couple weeks when reading about this, and it dawned on me that when I heard of a man after God's own heart, I always just kind of understood it in itself. I kind of just took it. I kind of just figured it out, so to speak. But I never dove into the specificness of it as to what it would entail, or the specifics of what could be considered one after God's own heart. Maybe I'm feeble of mind and slow, but it dawned on me, I just accepted it and kind of got it, but I never got it until I came across this article that made me dwell into what I just talked about, the specifics of what makes a person this. again, really, David was an example of this. David was an Old Testament figure, a real figure. He was an Old Testament person exhibiting a New Testament and New Covenant example that we receive from Christ. He is exhibiting what we are to exhibit as Christians here after the church was established in the New Testament, the New Covenant, first century. It's these characteristics that we all should look at and to strive to follow as followers of Christ and as Christians. In conclusion, just as a final reminder, do we have faith? Do we trust in God in all circumstances? Do we have love for others, even our enemies? Are we humble? Do we operate with integrity? Do we seek forgiveness for our sins when we fall short? And lastly, do we worship God in all circumstances, even in our low times? I believe we all do. I believe it's all what we are to be as Christians. And we study each and one of these things on a regular basis, on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, year in and year out. We talk about all these specific topics. But I encompass them all into one reminder that is what we should strive for, to be followers of Christ and or one who would be titled a man after God's own heart. So with that being said, I hope you find this well and applicable.
Open up your Bibles to Jeremiah chapter 1. Jeremiah chapter 1. We got about 15 minutes. We'll get a little bit through this. John Wilson was asking, are we going to do one chapter of each Sunday? Because that's going to take a long time. And first I told him, we'll probably, there's a lot of repetition, we'll probably combine things. But then I thought, we did Job one chapter at a time. And we got through that okay. At least I enjoyed that. But we'll see how it goes. There is some repetition in Jeremiah, but there's a lot of good things. And last time I worked through this was at school at Sunset back in 2008. So this is really my first in-depth work through, and I would like to try to get as much in there as I can, and perhaps you'd like to follow along with me in that study. We'll see how it goes. So let's start. I'm not going to give a typical introduction as we normally do with these letters. We're going to allow Jeremiah to do that for us. He does a bit of that and gives us an outline, I think, of how what we're going to find in the book. We'll find all this in chapter 1. So let's read verses 1 through 3 first. The words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, of the priests who were in Anathoth in the land of Benjamin, to whom the word of the Lord came in the days of Josiah, the son of Ammon, the king of Judah, in the 13th year of his reign. It came also in the days of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, until the end of the 11th year of Zedekiah, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, until the exile of Jerusalem in the 5th month. Okay. So right off the bat, we have the divine call of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, of the priests who were in Anathoth. I'll get that eventually. Now, so when, in those verses, pretty obvious, but when did he start his ministry? When did Jeremiah start?
During the days of Josiah.
During the days of Josiah. Things must have been pretty horrible in the days of Josiah.
Not necessarily.
Why?
He was a good king.
Yeah, he was a good king. He was turning things around and things were getting better. Now, imagine that. You were around probably, maybe he was around, maybe not, but I'm sure he heard about King Manasseh and the horrible things he did and other bad kings, and now he's around here during the time of King Josiah. Remember, he started as a young king. As he got older, it was really turning things around and thinking, boy, I'm glad we're back on track. And then all of a sudden, hey, Jeremiah, I got some things I want to tell you. I'm going to bring in the Babylonians and wipe out Judah. But things are getting better. We got Josiah the king. Aren't things going to get better? And sometimes we get caught up in these thoughts that things are going to get better, but maybe God has other plans. He knows the bigger picture. So this had to be a shock to Jeremiah. And it tells us that he is the son of Hilkiah. Is that a name you've seen or read before? Do you know who Hilkiah is? Hilkiah.
He was the priest that was serving when Josiah when they found the book. Right?
Yeah, he's the one that found the law. He was the high priest we read about who finds the law, and he goes, hey, look what I found. and of course, he hadn't read it to him. They had not read it in a long time. Some think that this might be Jeremiah's father. He is of the line of Aaron, Jeremiah. He is of Aaron, the line of Aaron. And we know that here, and we'll look at in a moment. But I do not think this is the same high priest, Hilkiah, because this one is giving us, we're given a little bit of extra information of the priests who were in Anathoth. That is about 8 miles northeast of Jerusalem. It is one of the Levitical cities, one of the ones that was given to Aaron's line. That's probably Jeremiah. He could have been the son of the high priest, but I think that would have been more specific as naming him Hilkiah. Hilkiah the high priest, giving him his designation, but he doesn't. So I'm wondering if maybe this is not the same guy. Could be, but my guess is no. And we're told here that to whom the word of the Lord came in the days of Josiah the son of Ammon, the king of Judah. We also know, looking in other places in the Bible from the Kings and the Chronicles, that Jeremiah seems to know some people in high places. He's well versed with a lot of folks. There's 2 Shallums mentioned in 2 Kings chapter 22, also in 32. We think this is probably the same person. It's someone that Jeremiah knows. They have a lot of influence. They're advisors to the King Josiah. So Jeremiah knows what's going on. Some of the commentators think that he's in his teen years at the time of his call. Maybe. I tend to think he's probably in his 20s, but we don't know. We know he's young. He begins his ministry in the 13th year of Josiah. That would be 627 BC. His reign continues through Jehoahaz, who is not mentioned here, but he will come after Josiah. Then Jehoiakim, who is mentioned. Then Jehoiachin, who's not mentioned. And then Zedekiah. Even all the way to the fall of Jerusalem. Anybody remember the date or the year for the fall of Jerusalem? What year is that?
586.
Yeah?
586.
586, that is correct. 586 is when it's come. So he begins in 627, goes all the way to 586. Man, that's not that far away. Not that far away for Jeremiah. And he'll continue his prophetic work after that. Where do you remember, or if you've ever read through Jeremiah recently, what happens to Jeremiah after the fall? Where does he end up?
Egypt.
Yeah, Egypt. Does he go there of his own accord?
Really.
No, they forced him to go. He does not want to go to Egypt. And so we continue on. Let's read verses 4 to verse 9. Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I have appointed you a prophet to the nations. Then I said, Alas, Lord God, behold, I do not know how to speak, because I am a youth. But the Lord said to me, Do not say, I am a youth, because everywhere I send you, you shall go, and all that I command you, you shall speak. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, declares the Lord. Then the Lord stretched out his hand and touched my mouth, and the Lord said to me, Behold, I have put my words in your mouth. All right. Interesting. I like this section. So, typical transaction occurring here between the Lord and his newly appointed prophet. God speaks, or he appears to them. I think he is appearing to Jeremiah in a vision here. The hearer of the Lord finds or tries to come up with some reason or excuse why they cannot do it. The Lord promises to empower him. Then the prophet accepts the task at hand. So you got the word of the Lord came. Frequently, we typically see that in different places. The verse in verse 5 is a great statement. We like this one. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. I like that. What does that imply?
Yeah, plans.
He had a plan. He had a plan. The word, we call this the things that happens in our lives that God already planned before we're even born. We call it sometimes providence. Providence. We see that happening here. Certain things were put in place to ensure Jeremiah would be where he's at that moment, so God can give him this appointment. And there's a lot of the verbiage used here are things that Jeremiah would understand. Being a priest of the line of Aaron, he would understand what's being said here. I knew you, I consecrated you, I have appointed you. Yeah, I mean, you're already thinking you're pretty high up there as far as the workings of the Lord go, being a priest, being in the Levites, directly from Aaron. But now, no, you got another job. You're going to be a prophet as well. So that's a little bit more on Jeremiah's plate. In fact, if you see how he lays all this out, if you're ever wanting to do a devotional, here's a great devotional outline. I formed you from the womb, the divine development. I knew you, the divinely discerned. I consecrated you, divinely desired. I have appointed you a prophet to the nation, divinely dispatched. 4 points right there. You could do that for a Sunday night Devo. So I also got word formed from the Hebrew word yastar. It means to fashion. It is the same word that God used of Adam. He formed him from the dust of the earth. Same word. He knew, term of knowing or to take care of and understanding. Consecrated, he would know and understand that term. It's a sanctified term. I think that's the way the King James has it, sanctified. And then finally, appointed. In this case, God had given Jeremiah a ministry to perform. He set him in place. While this wording is precise as to God's intent, it should not be interpreted as that Jeremiah had no will of his own. And that's, of course, proven in the very next verse, because how does Jeremiah respond? What's his response there? What would it say? Alas, O Lord, I'm but a youth, and I do not know how to speak because I am a youth. So let's first look at that word youth. That word youth is used in two ways throughout the Hebrew. It's used as for infants, but it's also used for men or those who have not been married, the unmarried. So that can go all the way up to 30 years old. If they're not married, they can be called a youth in the Hebrew. We can find places throughout the Old Testament where that is the case. So discerning Jeremiah's age here from that term, he's either a baby or he's around in his upper 20s. I would put him maybe in 18, maybe 23, a little younger, somewhere in those areas. That's what I probably would say he's at.
So he's not a priest.
Huh?
So he's not a priest then.
Well, no, not yet. But yeah, he's definitely of the line. But he would understand these things, and he's living in the city of the Levites. So I think he would have some knowledge of these things. But yes, he is not a priest yet. And he's not going to be, because what is he going to be? He's going to be a prophet. Good discernment there. Now, where what was I going to go to next? Oh, so he's a youth. One of the things I like to think about whenever I'm reading through Jeremiah, Lamentations. Who wrote the book of Lamentations? Jeremiah. In Lamentations 3:27, Jeremiah says this: It is good for a man that he should bear the yoke in his youth. That is an interesting study. If you get a chance to go back and look at the context and try to discern what is Jeremiah talking about. Bear the yoke in his youth. Look at that. Because what is a yoke? Something like a cow you'd put over your shoulders. It's a burden. Take a look at that and study that out. That would be a good study. So Jeremiah, he responds in this way because how does he see himself? Does he think he's worthy or if he's the right guy?
No.
Why not?
It
looks like
green.
a lot of work.
He's green? It looks like a lot of work. What did you say? He's green?
Right,
Yeah, he's not.
young.
He's too young. In that day, how often do the youth speak up? They don't. They don't. Like I remember, what was that whippersnapper in Job chapter 41? What was his name? Elihu. What was his name? Elihu. He recognized his youth and was too young to speak up. He didn't want to speak over the elders. He knew his place, but boy, after hearing a thing, he couldn't keep his mouth shut anymore. And he regretted that, that's for sure.
Maybe there was some fear involved here also.
Yes. I mean,
And rightly so, considering what happened to him.
yeah, the task set before him is big. And he doesn't, I don't think he probably fully understands how big because he's living in the time of Josiah. Things are getting a little better. But if he's done much reading at all the law, he knows that this is going to be a big task ahead. One of the commentators, I thought this was interesting. This is why I like to say commentators are helpers. We got to be careful pulling out the commentators. He said this from about verses 7 and 8. When Moses shunned God's call to deliver Israel from Egyptian bondage, the anger of the Lord burned against him. However, on this occasion, God reacted to Jeremiah's response with words of encouraging confidence. So he's making this comparison between Moses and Jeremiah about how they responded and how God responded. And he's making it sound like when Moses did it, God got angry when he made the same comment. But when Jeremiah did it, he encouraged him. Is that a good comparison? And how would you know?
Moses was a lot older than Jeremiah.
40 years old,
That's right.
And a lot more experience.
more experience. But not just that, and that's all true. That's true. But not just that.
Moses was 80.
No, that's when he went back.
When he called, after he'd been in.
Yeah, he at 40 he went. And you're right. He's closer to 80. You're right. He's a lot older. You got it right because he talks to the burning bush and then he heads out at 80. Yeah. So yeah, he's definitely there. But when God first talked to him, and he first had a complaint, what was God's reaction on his first complaint? Well, throw down your staff, Moses. He turns his neck. Pick it up. Take your hand, put it in here, pull out, and different things happen each time. And God's showing him his power. He's working with him. And God keeps working with him, And how many times does Moses offer a complaint? 2 to 3 times, I can remember. It wasn't until the 3rd time that the anger of the Lord burned against Moses. He gave him a chance in the same way with Jeremiah. The difference with Jeremiah is he gave his complaint, like, I'm not sure. God encourages him, and then he takes it. So I don't see the two as being very comparable in the sense the commentator made. So when you see those things, go back and read and see, is that a good comparison? I would say no. Because the comparison is exactly the same. The only difference is that Moses kept complaining and looking for a way out. Jeremiah does not. And so, he says there, did we read 7 8? Yeah, we read down to verse 9. Everywhere I send you, you'll go. All that I command you, you will speak. Do not be afraid of them. I am with you to deliver you. So, God knew the nature within his Jeremiah, and Jeremiah is going to be one of the most well-known prophets of his day. we read about him and people reading his letter all over the place. In Kings and Daniel and Isaiah, we see his name popping up quite a few times. And the key to Jeremiah's readiness, not his age, definitely not his magnetic personality or his ability, his readiness would prove that because God would be with him. He trusted in the Lord. Jeremiah wrote that there in verse 9, God stretched out his hand and touched my mouth. Now, what does that mean? Why would he do that? So he told him, do not be afraid, I'm with you. Then the Lord stretched out his hand and touched my mouth. And the Lord said, behold, I have put my words in your mouth. Where we read something like that before? Isaiah in chapter 6, when he too was like, I'm a man of unclean words, surrounded by unclean people, I can't. And the difference is being that in that vision, when the angel takes the tongs and a coal and touches his tongue with it, there, I've cleansed you, and now you can speak. And here, God's saying, I'm going to give you what you need to say. I think that covers the worry of his youth and inexperience, being green around the color, as Gail put it. And so he's encouraged by that. And now the appointment is, oh man, we're already past time. The appointment gets explained in verses 10 through 16. That's quite a bit. So read that, and this is like the best part. This is where I wanted to get to. So read verses 10 to the end of the chapter. That'll be the introduction we've got there. This is the good part. There's two images, and notice when you read through this, at verse 11, the word of the Lord came to me saying, what do you see, Jeremiah? And then later on, in verse 13, again, what do you see? And he compliments Jeremiah with his what he says. That's a lot like what we do with our kids. John would show me a picture of something that he and Jesse worked on, that hot rod. How old was Jesse when you guys started building that?
About 7.
7 years old, and when did you finish?
22 years later.
22 years later. And when you got a 7-year-old, you're working with your kid, and you're trying to get them to help or to see where they're at, maybe help them learn to give them a little confidence. You say, okay, look in here. All right, what do you see? Are you perceiving things correctly? Do you have eyes to see what I see? And Jeremiah is going to see those things. And he's already going to start working with them. He's going to get him to where he needs to be. So think about that when you read through these and try to discern why God is putting these images there and what those things might mean.